Introduce Drew. Good morning, Drew. How are you doing this
Very
morning?
good. Great. Glad to be here. And definitely thanks for having me on the Past the Mic series. I enjoyed watching the two prior, so I was excited to join to talk more about some of my expertise and what I've seen in the industry, really all around SharePoint. So looking forward to kind of going through this today.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to joining all of us this morning. So today, like we seeing on the screen, we will be talking about SharePoint management. So I'll leave it to you, Drew. Take it away. We've got about an hour ahead of us, and we'll try to keep about 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end. So feel free to ask your questions in the chat in the Q&A section, everyone. And we'll try to answer as many of those as possible.
Thank you.
All right,
so
all yours, Drew.
I'm gonna start off a little bit of the background on myself. So who am I? So my name is Drew Madelung. I'm a pretty long time MVP, really coming from the SharePoint administration background. So I do work at a company called Protiviti today. I am basically a Microsoft 365 consultant, and I've been doing that for around 10 years, coming on purely in the Microsoft 365 space. But I also have two daughters. It's really fun having a couple under very young, and I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So big sports fan up here, excited for the weather to kind of break. But my history, I actually started, I came from a SharePoint administrator. So I was a SharePoint administrator a little bit in 2007 for SharePoint 2007, but then really broke into it hardcore in SharePoint 2010. I managed a fairly large farm for an organization and really kind of took, in my opinion, SharePoint 2010 to the brink. So I really come from that IT pro side, the IT management, that infrastructure. I had to manage farms, I had internal, external. And then after that, I took a journey into consulting. And since then, I've been honestly a SharePoint consultant. And this story and this journey that I'm on kind of has moved into what have I seen in the industry being a SharePoint consultant and then being also a SharePoint administrator? What do people need to know, right? So I've seen and worked with organizations from a couple thousand people to 50 people up to I have one going on right now around 80,000. So seen all different sizes of companies, industries, and I've kind of started to see what do SharePoint administrators need to know about, and how is SharePoint management started to evolve. And because what we've seen and the things that I used to do back in SharePoint 2010 and up through 2013 and 2016 and 2019 has completely changed when you're dealing with SharePoint Online. And a lot of the organizations I work with and people I work with is about how do we transition? How do we start to evolve the processes and the procedures that we had in the past into modern management? And that's what I like to think of as modern management in SharePoint Online. And what do we have to do? And how is that different? So what I've seen is a lot of evolution. And I'll talk through this evolution from the governance side of this, but really as it gets deeper into it, the provisioning, the lifecycle, and the security and compliance is becoming more crucial than it used to be in the past. It's just more harmony between these tools as they work together. So I'm kind of walking through this journey that I see, but I do want to make sure we start with what does managing SharePoint actually mean, right? What is if you own SharePoint, or if you're about to inherit SharePoint, or if you are just starting a cloud migration, what does kind of managing SharePoint mean to you? And I like to make sure you understand what is powered by SharePoint. So when we're thinking of SharePoint Online, I'm going to be primarily talking about SharePoint Online here. If I'm using the word SharePoint, it means SharePoint Online. I'll reference SharePoint on premises if I have to, but when you're thinking about SharePoint management, you have to understand what is powered by it, because when you're thinking about the policies and procedures that you need to work with, you need to know what am I changing, right? If I'm changing a sharing setting, what is that impact going to be? If I'm creating a provisioning policy, how does that affect SharePoint? And how does that affect Teams? How does that affect Yammer? How does that affect the ecosystem of Microsoft 365? Because I can tell you what can SharePoint do. Right? You need to know what that is as an administrator to be able to build the processes and policies around it. So when I see administration, I see a lot of what do we want to do to control it, right? And what I think of is not just controlling to control, but what are the policies that you have to control? Do we have to have policies for external sharing? Do we have to have policies for provisioning? Do we have these existing rules that we have to follow for specific reasons? And a lot of that can be by industry, by the types of data that you have in there. Do you have PII? Do you have sensitive data, confidential data? Who's accessing it? Do you have a breakdown by different organizations if you're, like, say, your holding company? And then who owns those decisions? right? Is the SharePoint administrator empowered to do it? Do you have a committee that's empowered to do it? And then if you do that, once you have that understanding, how do you build towards adoption? So SharePoint administration is not just this administrative the tool. It's you have to think of how are we empowering our users. We're investing in technology, right? We're building new solutions, not just to make the platform function because we don't have to deal with that server side infrastructure anymore. We need to think about how do we empower the users to get sustained adoption, not just this. I think of adoption as this big peak when you might roll out SharePoint Online and then it kind of falls off. You want to get kind of this running slow curve to keep those metrics, keep those numbers high. And that is really kind of its core. When you start to answer those questions, you start to think about what do we need to do in the modern world. And to start, what is powered by SharePoint? So SharePoint Online is the backend for all files in Microsoft 365. So whether I'm in Microsoft Teams, whether I'm in OneDrive for Business, those files are all stored in SharePoint, right? It is the backend solution for content. It's the backend solution for files. So when you think about it that way, wherever I'm working with files, the policies and procedures you have are going to affect other solutions. So if I'm deciding on my sharing configuration for SharePoint, my file sharing, you don't just think about how am I going to share files from my SharePoint team site. You're also going to be thinking about how do I share files from Microsoft Teams? How do I share files from OneDrive? Because it's your file repository that you're managing. So the policies and procedures as a SharePoint administrator go across platforms. So SharePoint administrator, you're almost moved into this role of file administrator, like you're this content administrator and process administrator. So a lot of organizations I see in SharePoint administrators, they've moved into roles around security and compliance. They've moved into roles around the Power Platform and automation because those are things that are empowered by SharePoint behind the scenes. And where I really want to make sure people understand this is around administration of groups and SharePoint together. So groups is not a new solution around here. It's been around, I think, since 2017. It started up because of it used to be called Office 365 groups, and it started from the Exchange side of the world. And they've said, we want to bring a better way to govern multiple applications under one umbrella, right? And that one umbrella is a group of people. It's your identity. So when you create new Microsoft Teams and you create new SharePoint team sites and you start to create a new group out in Outlook, those are going to be provisioning in Microsoft 365 groups. And why it's important to understand that these in the SharePoint world is that you're going to have a different permission model for those than you do for SharePoint sites that are not group backed. So understanding that you have group backed sites and non-group backed sites is a core platform solution that you need to understand, because there's going to be different capabilities and different management options depending on that backend resource. But a group itself is going to be that Azure AD identity that says whoever's in this Azure AD group, it's like a group with superpowers, and they're going to have different roles across that workload. So that's how a team owner is actually part of the SharePoint site collection owner group. When you're doing sharing settings, you're setting them at the group, not at the SharePoint site level. So you need to make sure you understand that groups are powering modern SharePoint team sites. And when you think about administration, you start to see, like in the SharePoint Admin Center, which ones are group backed, which ones aren't. And that's going to help you understand the rules and procedures that you want to put in place around modern SharePoint management, because this is not something that will ever exist on premises. This is cloud only. So this is something that we've had to evolve in modern SharePoint management to account for. And when you move into SharePoint management, right, as the on-premises infrastructure has gone away, you're managing SharePoint, you're not just thinking about the technology, right? I'm not just thinking about how many content databases do I need, how many web applications do I need. You start to think about, I need to figure out what the business actually needs and how do I devise modern training and communication, right? How are the people going to be interacting with SharePoint Online today? Because a lot of times in the past, you had to go on VPN and you had to have a firewall, and then most likely you couldn't access your SharePoint Online on your phone. And now you have mobile apps, now you have web browser, now you have a complete kind of aspect of, I need to access SharePoint Online where I can, when I can, because that's how I'm going to get to my files. So gathering those requirements and figuring out what the adoption you need for SharePoint leads to the IT controls that you're going to put in place. So don't just think about it as, what am I going to, like, don't put the barriers around and say, what do I need to do for SharePoint? It seems like, no, what do the users and what do the people need to do that are working with files in Microsoft 365? What are the rules that I need to have to support that as an organization or compliance level? And then how do I empower them to continue to work, right? How do I give them the functionality that they need without being a barrier for entry? And that's where you start to see this combination of multiple IT teams together. So I've seen this a lot, whether you have an applications team and an infrastructure team, or maybe just an infrastructure team, and then you have a security team, and you might have if you're larger, you might have an information governance team, you might have a risk team. Though you're going to have to start, as you move into Office or Microsoft 365, and especially from the back end of content for SharePoint, you need to bring these other teams together. It's not, you can't just work in a silo for thinking about how am I going to be managing SharePoint Online. You have to think about what am I going to be impacting when I make changes in SharePoint Online downstream to other applications. And it goes the same way. If you're in a role and you're working on, let's say, performing an e-discovery search, right? You need to understand how that legal counsel would be able to ask someone in the content side of the world, most likely that SharePoint administrator, say, how do I know what sites to pull? So that makes sure you need to understand the URL structure. How do I get to content? What is SharePoint? So you have to have a much more open line of communication, that the siloed version of SharePoint management just doesn't exist anymore. So, I mean, I think that's just a huge takeaway to think about this. If you're working in this space, think about the people that you need to communicate with more and the people that they need to communicate with you. And how do we keep that line of communication open? And I'll talk through some ideas that I've seen to be successful in that space. But I want to start with coming back to the SharePoint administration, right? What does SharePoint administration entail, and what are the ways that we do that? So the two core central solutions for this is going to be around PowerShell and admin centers. And you'll see I don't just have SharePoint admin center, we're going to have multiple when we're thinking about administration. But I want to make sure I touch on PowerShell, that don't be scared of PowerShell. So there is a lot of functionality that's released in SharePoint Online that comes to PowerShell first. There's a lot of tools out there to help support it. The main one I'd love to see is, if you haven't looked into the PnP PowerShell modules, there's a great collection of solutions out there, along with a lot of scripts that you can find to do different things for administration using PowerShell. So let's say there's the ability to turn off a specific function when it's released. If there's a lot of reporting I see for this, or automation that you need to see around administration, PowerShell is going to be a lot of the ways you need to go. But as the SharePoint administrator, my advice is make sure you know that, right? You don't need to be an expert in PowerShell. You don't be scared by it. There's a lot of pre-built solutions out there for you to look at, but you do need to know it exists. And if you have to make changes, start to become comfortable with it for writing and connecting and looking at your different sites. You'll learn a lot about SharePoint administration behind the scenes by just running like a get SPO tenant command and saying, what are the values that exist here? And what you'll see is those values then are mirrored in the admin centers most of the time. So if I go into and I change the sharing setting in the SharePoint admin center, you'll see a corresponding change in the backend when you look at it from SharePoint. So you have kind of this dual way to look at it. But 99% of the time, you're going to be in the admin center side of the world. And that's where you're going to be going, where you're making your configuration changes. And a lot of people, what I like to think is, don't just set it and forget it, right? Being a SharePoint administrator is not a one-time look at the SharePoint admin center and then never come back to it. That is going to be a place that you go to monitor your service health, to monitor what's changing, because now you're in an evergreen environment. We're no longer in this static solution that gets upgraded every 6 months. So what do we need to do, and how do we prepare our organization, which means you have to be within and logging into that admin center when you can. Now, there are different roles across your tenant. There are different admin centers that you should be working with. So because SharePoint is powered again by content and files, so you're going to start to move into other areas outside of the admin center. Now, the admin center for SharePoint, you're going to be, that's your core, right? If I'm working in the term store, if I'm creating my home site, and really if I'm working with my sites, how many sites do I have? What sites exist? You can start to go in there and build different information. And that's going to be kind of your core. But when you start to think about protection, how do I think about finding content, or how do I think about licensing the right users? Or I think a core one people think about is what happens when users leave, right? What is that life cycle of the user management, and what happens to their OneDrive site, right? What happens to, what if there is a risk of someone signing up? How do we ensure that when someone leaves the organization for a reason, that we can remove access at the appropriate point in time? Or a common ask for support is going to be, what if someone's on leave for an extended period and they need to get access to someone's OneDrive? Well, actually, I mean, that since OneDrive is SharePoint, you need a way to let people know that, yes, I can go in and grant an administrator access for a period of time and then remove that access. But that's actually granting SharePoint permissions. So you're going to be, as a SharePoint administrator, become familiar with the other areas in Microsoft 365 as it affects files, because that's going to be start to see where you have some of that overlap. And on the role side, I think of modern management as you don't really have that farm administrator role anymore. Now you have a global administrator. Now, a global administrator, I don't recommend anyone on the SharePoint admin side to necessarily be global administrators unless you're kind of have that role inside of your organization from a RACI perspective, but keep that very limited. 5 or less is really recommended, and those roles should always be secondary accounts. You want to have a couple break glass accounts in those, but be very cautious in using those. In the SharePoint side, we have one SharePoint admin role, right? That's going to be the one that can go in and manage that SharePoint admin center, and you're going to utilize that to configure SharePoint. Now, if you need to have more, think about ways to manage or just in time some of that access for SharePoint admin. Think about empowering some people into that role, but obviously not everyone. Don't overdo that SharePoint admin access, and think about some reviews of that access, because there is some capabilities to say I can go into someone's OneDrive, grant myself access, and go look at that content. So be wary of kind of over granting, and that's just kind of following least privilege access. Now, when you're one thing I like to think about that's changed with this is also automation, right? So if we're doing automation for reporting, or if we're doing automation for connecting into SharePoint, try not to use those SharePoint admin role accounts. Try not to use that user-based identity. You want to start to use app-based permissions where you can. And app-based permissions says I can take an application, a service principal, and say I want to grant this person, this account, this principal only a specific type of permission that can access SharePoint or potentially other applications. And then you govern that, right? So you're not necessarily using the user login, which is going to potentially cause a chance of risk, because that's also going to force you through modern auth versus having kind of that potentially basic authentication enabled. So make sure you understand app-based permissions and how you can configure those in Azure AD, along with the SharePoint administrator role, and then the higher rules around it and who kind of governs those. But I do want to touch just for a second on what this looks like from an admin center side. So I'm going to start in the SharePoint admin center. So if you haven't seen the newest SharePoint admin center, we all are in modern these days. The thing I like to highlight is what we see over here on the left, and some of the things that people don't necessarily jump to that I see that I want to see more SharePoint administrators go into. And that's going to be starting to manipulate some of the data that you see in your active sites information here. So this has been such a blessing for us to start to see how much content we have out here, starting to see data, starting to see files. And as we get into it, starting to see more information around sensitivity, external sharing. And what's great is being able to customize your columns out here and actually customizing your view. So don't just think of this active sites page as one location to go to. Think of it as, what else do I want to see? Because there's a lot of views that when I talk to organizations, they don't know that a lot of these exist, right? They don't know that I can go out and create, that they have pre-built views for us. They don't know that we can go out and create our own views. So use this as a way to start to figure out what's going on in your organization. And I love seeing this around what sites are group backed, what sites are connected to teams, and sites without a group, right? So I talked about that back end of what you're gonna have and what you understand, and then why you need to understand that is because as you start to sort and filter, that's going to be one of your main pivots. Is it a group or is it not a group? And this is going to give you such a better understanding and management area to do this versus kind of having to use maybe the classic admin center. So take advantage of this, right? Come out here more often and become experienced in this. So when someone asks a question, you know what can be done out here. The other thing I want to highlight is around sharing. So I'll go a little more into sharing around this, but I love to make sure that people understand that since OneDrive is SharePoint, SharePoint is OneDrive, they are the same thing. If you start working on different controls or permissions, all of those are going to be inherited down, right? So if I wanted to make sharing more configure, let's say less open, remove anyone access from SharePoint, it also removes it in OneDrive. Because since OneDrive is a SharePoint site collection, you can't have this be more permissive. So it's nice to know that as you start to make changes in OneDrive from a configuration standpoint, you're also impacting SharePoint. And that's a cool, so don't think about And if you need to be more granular, you absolutely can, right? We can get very granular with some of these controls, but think of the administration as you're setting the top level, and then you can start to go into different sites to manage specific controls by site, right? But you have to be enabled at the top level. So I wanted to go in and change policies like my external sharing policy for this site. It's going to only reflect what's available in my organization. So in the SharePoint Admin Center, this is really where you're going to be able to go to manage by site, manage your organization. And then the last piece I'd love to touch on is utilize these cards. So some people, I talk to people and they say that I just kind of scroll through it, I don't look at it. But as a SharePoint administrator, this is going to be your key to get information that you don't normally think about, right? The message center information is so key now in modern management to know what's coming. What does this mean, right? Like you need to be, as an administrator, your role is to keep up to date with these things. Right? What does this actually mean? And is it going to impact my users? The cards in here are going to help you figure out this information. So don't underestimate coming in here and adding different cards. I've already added all mine. I can add information barriers. This will help you understand your environment. And I think understanding your environment, understanding what's coming are two huge aspects of modern administration that you're going to be coming into in the admin centers to do this work. The other two admin centers I want to touch on is going to be around the compliance admin center and security. So if you are working as a SharePoint administrator, there are going to be functions such as, so scroll down in here and left, if I'm working with information protection, so different labels, if I want to enable classification for my sites, you're actually doing it here. If I want to enable retention, I'm doing it here. If I want to enable DLP, communication compliance, insider risk management, all of these are functions that exist in another environment or another admin center, but they impact SharePoint. So I want to call those out because if someone's creating DLP rules and you're a SharePoint administrator, you need to know that those rules are being created because people are going to start to see data, if they have it configured to, let's say, block access based on sensitive data, it's going to be impacting your SharePoint environment. So that's why that cohesiveness of if I'm making changes out here, if I'm making changes out here, people need to understand what those changes are because they impact each other. You're not in that siloed world. If I'm creating different group rules out in Azure AD, all of those need to come back and be understood by you as that SharePoint administrative role. Because if I create groups out here, right, it's going to actually go create a Microsoft 365 group. It's going to create another SharePoint site for us. So to me, that is a key area that you need to make sure you understand on the admin center side. But to get to that, right, to get to that level, and how do you start to work together in that? And that's where I think of modern SharePoint governance. So I've written a lot of SharePoint governance documents before. I've had some that have been probably 40 pages long of how we're going to manage and govern your SharePoint environment. And that process is starting to change. And that governance document, if you have one, I bet you haven't touched it in years. I will tell you, I've had people ask me to create these and I give it to them and then I come back a year later and they haven't done anything with it, they haven't touched it. This is an evergreen solution. Right? This is not something that you can kind of set it and forget it, as I said, with the admin centers. So don't just create that document. Create a living, breathing solution. A committee is what I love to go down. And that's how you start to bring in those other organizations together, those other business units into it, so they can help manage those decisions. So how are we going to manage our training? Because training is not just SharePoint, it's going to be around our whole organization. How do we manage security? If I'm making changes in SharePoint, it's going to affect those Azure AD settings as well. So make sure that this group comes together, and I love having a cadence meeting for this. I love thinking of putting these out in SharePoint Online as pages and portals to build the place that people can go to understand what's available in your organization. And as you meet and create content, and as you meet and create decide decisions, that those go out into the public so they can start to see that. So some of the decisions you have to make, right? What are the decisions we have in modern SharePoint governance that's kind of changed? One of the core ones we have now is around information architecture. So this world of subsites has gone away, and there's some very good technical reasons for that. And the future of that is hub sites, and I think the future, it's here, right? And a lot of organizations are using these. I've seen success in them, but I'm not seeing people use them enough. I want people to understand that hub sites are a very powerful tool to start to bring and gather data together. But you need to understand your use case for those hub sites and then empower people to join them, right? Don't kind of limit that hub site join once it's been created. Think about how we can empower people to do that hub site join once we've established what kind of the higher level framework is for hub sites, and trying to go find one example is a really good one in one use case in your organization. And when you have that, you can bring in site templates to support it. Now on the security side, this is an area that has definitely evolved a ton. In my experience, I've started to see SharePoint administrators need to understand more than just your local farm. Is going to be, what are the ways that we interact with other organizations? What are the ways we interact with people inside of groups? How are we in charge of the life cycle of that data? And I asked them before doing these, I've asked them SharePoint administrators, and this is one of the core ones they talked about, that they're starting to be put in front of us. They need to understand this logic and empower security teams. Are telling them we need to go do this, and the SharePoint administrators are like, well, how, right? And as an administrator, that's going to be an area you need to grow in. And I see a lot of questions around external. So build those sharing guidelines and understand what kind of tech works for those. And as we continue this governance, we have navigation and home sites, right? So continuing down that idea of governance, what can we govern? We can also govern global navigation. So we have the ability to do global navigation in SharePoint Online now, right out of the box. I used to have a custom application that we built that would go out and we deploy it as a web part, and it would give you a global navigation solution. This is a common ask almost at every organization. But now you have it built into SharePoint Online, and that governance team can help define what should be in that global navigation, because it starts to spread across your resources, right? And it's built on this logic of a home site, where you can start to figure out as a governance team what should be on this home site. Is it my internet homepage? Is it just going to be a landing page just maybe for some resources? And how can we be flexible with that as new business units come in, as new links come in? What is the process to add data to that navigation? And when you get into that, as you start to dive into those portals, we get a lot into branding, right? What I love to think about it in the branding side of it as an administrator is, don't over brand. We don't have to go in this idea of don't make SharePoint look like SharePoint. I built some of the craziest looking SharePoint sites that just look at all like SharePoint, and I've completely changed in the fact of when organizations say to do this, I'm like, let's use out of the box, please. What can we do with our modern web parts? Let's make sure we don't use custom master pages. Let's go through theming, through templating, and let's get to modern. Right. Modern branding is going to be the best way for users who are working with mobile, working in the cloud. Figure out ways to get to modern, and don't use that custom branding. Don't go change those divs and those controls. I did it in the past, and it's bitten me pretty bad from a UX standpoint. You log in one day, and before we had the sweep bar controls, I would move some data around, and all of a sudden you come back in the next day and it's bounced to the left and it looks terrible. Don't do that anymore. Right? Use what you can out of the box. When I'm thinking about governance, you're also thinking about your empowering users, right? Not just administration. How are we going to train people, train the employees to be able to work with the governance rules that we have in place, right? How do we, and I love to think about this from the champion network side. So I've seen such good success building ninjas, building champions, building power users, building that network in Yammer and in SharePoint to start to figure out how to empower them to get their work done, and they'll start helping everyone else. And that method has worked very well. I love using the ninja idea. Actually, I did one where we gave little trophies after you went through a champion network, and they put it before we were fully remote. They would put them on their desk, so if someone walked by, they'd know if they had a Microsoft 365 question or SharePoint question, they'd see a little trophy because they've done it, right? And it kind of shows some value and some gamification to it, and you can start to get some of that with Viva Learning now too. So don't underestimate the need for this as a SharePoint administrator for your governance rules. And a lot of this can kind of span 365. And on support side, don't underestimate support. Like if you're making a change in SharePoint Online, or if there's a function that's being released, right? So as an administrator, if there's a new tool coming out, let's say we're releasing a home site, or we're adding hub site join, make sure that the support team knows how that will work, right? So if they have a question or there's an issue, that there's always a direct line in a circle. So I've seen somewhere if it goes to L2 that we have a Microsoft team that the support team can ask any questions directly in line. So if there's a help desk cycle, they're not out of it, right? But there's a very quick communication line to them without having to really deal with some side phone calls or going into an ITSM tool. Keep those open communication lines moving. And Now, a big one that people have forgotten about is integrations. And this happens it can be with third-party tools. It can be with existing Microsoft 365 tools. It can be people going out and buying a SharePoint app. Make sure you understand the governance of your application, right? If someone's going to the SharePoint store, what do you want to do there? And how do we govern that? So once you govern that, you kind of start to provide best practices to your organization. So you don't want to put huge barriers around these integrations. You want to put capabilities and say, here's how, if you're going to build a web part, here are the rules that you need to follow. Here's Microsoft's best recommendations. Here's an approval process if you want to add a SharePoint app. So you need to make sure you empower them, not just kind of put those barriers in place. And if you have to come up with rules, that's fine, right? That's great. That's part of the process of being a modern SharePoint administrator. And we come to kind of third-party tools. Now we move into the cloud, almost every organization I work with has some type of third-party tool, right? And whether you use it for migration, if you're using it for reporting, if you're using it for like availability, people can go out buy custom web parts, custom solutions for intranets. There's a ton of security and compliance tools. Right? I mean, we're talking with, and be okay with that, right? Don't go out and build something custom when there's something that a third-party tool can do. Because when you're in the cloud, what's nice is if you go third-party, it's onto them to kind of help maintain that connection. So as Microsoft changes, if you build a custom solution to do something, you're in charge of that. You kind of have to make sure you maintain it. Third parties, they kind of have to maintain that. Kind of they do, right? It's kind of their role. So don't be scared of them, right? Be open to those building third-party tools. And I know, obviously, we're here with ShareGate. I'm a longtime ShareGate user. I've used it for multiple migrations, a lot of mentioned out there. So, I mean, Larry, is there anything you want to talk on kind of around ShareGate here? Was maybe some of the things that are coming for SharePoint administrators?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's always new stuff coming, when it comes to SharePoint and Teams management. Obviously, migration has always been at our core, but the whole kind of management aspect of it is still very prevalent, and we're investing a lot on that side as well. I mean, so from helping you inventory your environment, whether it's on the SharePoint side, on the Teams side, probably a lot of our customers here or past customers, those who've used this in the past, I've used us in migration scenarios, but that migration tool is also very powerful into a scenario of reorganizing and content management, right? Because you can move content and structure within your environment on the SharePoint and Teams side, right? Because we support Teams migrations now as well. Anything that can help you also kind of automate your Teams monitoring. So whether monitor inactive teams, understand the purpose of your teams, set kind of a custom security settings. So that's all possible now, and all that, without any kind of PowerShell necessary. Unlimited support as well is always available. And like you said, we always keep it up, and we do kind of like the all the upkeep to make sure we stay on top of everything that Microsoft releases, and that the application is always up and running and able to help you. And to answer your initial question about what's coming up, one interesting release that we're really looking forward to is provisioning. So we're going to be helping now on the Teams provisioning side as well, so that we manage the whole life cycle of Teams. So from its inception, its creation, and all the way to the end there. So the archiving. So yeah.
And I love hearing that kind of stuff, right? And so when I did my poll and I asked a bunch of my SharePoint administrators where their biggest concerns are, that kind of helped drive some of this conversation, right? Security compliance was a big one. Those integrations were a big one. Like how to understand how SharePoint works, but then also that SharePoint lifecycle for provisioning. And there's a lot of third-party that do this, and I've worked with organizations, and I think it's important to understand, what does modern SharePoint provisioning look like today? Because there are changes we can make and decisions that you have to make of how we are going to provision SharePoint. So I've done this in so many different ways, and every organization is a little bit different. I want to make sure we understand that there's been an evolution of this, right? When I was working more on SharePoint on premises, so much of this was you would submit a help desk request, and then you would have to go wait, and then someone would provision a SharePoint site, maybe by PowerShell. You have to make sure it's in the right content database, make sure you have the right site quota on it, make sure you go in and apply the old SharePoint site templates to them. That's not the way it needs to work anymore. I want to be able to be sitting on my phone and go create a SharePoint site and access that. I don't need to have kind of those barriers to entry, and you need to be faster with smarter templating. My templates aren't just in SharePoint. They need to be thinking about all of the services that are supporting it. So as I see organizations, I think about the pain points that they have. We need to think about the decisions you want to make for provisioning. And that core one is going to be, are we going to, how can, in my opinion, how can we use out of the box, right? How can we empower self-service using for identifying the requirements we have, and if it's slowly moving down more into custom if we have to. So when we start to figure out those requirements, we need to understand the tech that's available to us and think about that user entry point, right? Am I going to be creating this on my phone? Am I going to have to go into an ITSM tool and I have to go into a Power App to go create these? Am I going to go into Teams and create this all the time through like a bot, which I've done? And then that will tell us how you're going to move into that technical tooling for provisioning. I always like to make sure you think about it starting at the top, which is going to be around self-service. So as you start to get more and more complex, it becomes more and more cumbersome, right? So you start to have this idea of, if we start with self-service and we start to move down into the pillar or in the pyramid of complexity, you start to get into things like basically starting to cite templates, going all the way to P&P provisioning and P&P templates, and potentially all of these together. So as you're building your provision, if you're thinking about provisioning, how can we start at the top? And as you get more requirements, you start to move into more and more complexity tools based on those requirements. Now, when you think about our toolbox for this, you're going to start with creation, right? Are we going to be working with site templates? Are we going to be working with a form or a process for these? And how are we going to automate the process for creation, right? Are we going to have something go create the SharePoint team? Are we going to have it add a channel? Are we going to have it add a web part to the page? How are we going to administrate it? How are we going to add the level of administration for the process and the level of administration for the SharePoint, right? So you kind of have two levels of administration there. But think about, you're going to have this toolbox of solutions, and you're going to pick apart which ones you want to have in the Microsoft space. So you start to really dive into non-Microsoft solutions to empower Microsoft Teams, sorry, to empower SharePoint provisioning, which will also start to tie into Teams. So you think about provision, you think about templates. And you have SharePoint site templates, which would be, they used to be called site designs in the UI. They're still the same architecture in the back end, but take advantage of these. Go look at site templates. And when you create the site, it's going to say, hey, do you want to apply a template to this site? And you're going to get that after the fact. And Microsoft has a bunch of them built in, and you can go add your own and deploy them to the organization and apply them to specific people. So if you start thinking about governance and control, your modern administration moves into, how do I template this? And then how do I template Teams, which also a part of how do I basically, if I template Teams, how does that affect the SharePoint site? And what I want to make sure we understand here is that right now they're different, right? So if I'm creating templates in Teams, templates in SharePoint, they are different, but there's a connected templates are coming. We start to bring these solutions of templating together that we didn't have in the past. We also have the site lifecycle. So if I've done self-service, right, and I think of the movement of self-service is also about expiration. So we have a site, it's either going to, after the site's been created, it gets used, it's either going to get deleted or it's going to expire, right? That's the kind of logic you want to think about for modern provisioning, instead of the site just kind of sitting out there. Now, if there's retention, that's fine. Retention always wins, but that's okay. It's okay to let a site get removed. It's okay to let a site get deleted or expired, as long as we have retention in place. And Teams archiving is a great example for this. So if I have archiving, I can go in and actually, a lot of times your SharePoint site is part of your Microsoft team. When I archive that team, it's going to put that site in read-only, and that's fine. And then it can go expire, and I can always restore that if it's been expired, if it's within 30 days. So be okay with understanding this. Don't retain your SharePoint sites if you don't have to, and utilize the group expiration policies in there to start to remove content before you need to. So from a provisioning side, think about self-service, think about expiration, and think about empowering that before you get too custom as you dive into that. Now, thinking about retention and governance and expiration, start to think about what's newer around SharePoint management, and it's around security and compliance, right? How do we, if you're going to be asked, right, you're in charge of your files, you're in charge of managing your files, and do you know where they are? Right? Do you know that what I'm doing with my files in SharePoint, and how do I start to move to this administration of protection? How do I move to the administration of sharing? And as a SharePoint administrator, you kind of have to understand how you're going to add that protection, how I'm going to add that retention, and whether you might not be the one making the decision, but you might also be the one that you're going to be impacted the most by this. And as you start to secure your content, this has become an area where I've worked with SharePoint administrators that they've done back in SharePoint, and now they're starting to move into information protection and governance. That you need to know how this works, because as I sit with files that are sitting in SharePoint Online or sitting in Teams, and you want to classify them or protect them. This is kind of the evolution of protection in place or retention in place. I think of the record center in SharePoint on premises, and you would go out and you would move content all over in there and it would sit there. The modern side of that is information governance, where we have to start applying retention in place and labels in place. So as an administrator, you're going to start to need to be aware of that protection and governance to know where and when these labels are going to be applied. So that, as I talked about in that compliance admin center, that this is going to be an area that you'll start to dive into. And if you haven't yet, this is how you're going to start to learn about protection, how you're going to learn about the files that are sitting at rest in your SharePoint Online environment. And what's awesome about information protection, and what I've seen be so successful, is the classification on containers, right? So I've had SharePoint Online, you have, and we've always asked about how do we identify what exists on different SharePoint sites? How do I know if I create a SharePoint site that it's going to have different types of information, or I want to do something based on the SharePoint site classification? We've built solutions that would go in and add data to the property bag for those. We don't have to do that anymore. We now have sensitivity labels that we can actually put at the service level to say, when I create a new SharePoint site, it's going to have a sensitivity label that allows me to force specific rules on this. Do I want to make things more secure when I create that site? Do I want to remove external sharing? Do I want to force MFA? These are rules that you put in at the SharePoint, at the container level, right? At the group level. So when I create this, and if I say this site's supposed to be sensitive or highly sensitive, it's going to do something. Now that's great for reporting. If you remember, all the way back to the admin center I showed you, you can sort by sensitivity. You can go out and see what type of content do I have on my sites? What type of sites are people creating? And this is something that's definitely different than we've had in the past. This is not necessarily the SharePoint administrator owning it, but you're empowered by it. Right? You have to know how this works and what sensitivity labels are. And the same happens for retention. Modern retention is going to be there's two different kinds of retention for policies and labels, but this lives in the information governance space. So if you get questions of how am I going to retain information, don't go back and use that record center or the in-place records management solution. Microsoft Modern Management for files and retention is around the information governance suite, and that's going to be how you can retain information kind of at a regular retainer level. So if I create a file in OneDrive and I want to retain my files in OneDrive for an extended period of time, great. That's all done through retention labels now in the compliance center, no longer in the SharePoint admin center. And as you get to that next level of crown jewel data, you're going to move into records management, right? How do I don't use that classic record management solution, build records labels in the compliance admin center and add those to the right sites to protect those crown jewels of information you have. And the reason these impact you is because these are deployed by SharePoint site. So if I want to make certain sites available and add labels or records to specific sites, as a SharePoint administrator, you're going to be in charge of having to figure that out, right? They're going to say, how do I decipher what sites do what? How do I know what sites need these labels? What sites need to be deleted, right? Those are going to go down and kind of articulate down right into your SharePoint sites, because retention can retain. So if I want to keep these OneDrive sites for 1 year, if I want to keep these highly sensitive SharePoint sites for 3 years, or if I want to retain and delete it. So after, this is a little more with the team side, but if I want to delete specific types of data after every 7 years, right? A common one for financial institutions, 7 years. Those are going to be coming down and managing those files in SharePoint Online. And the last end of it is around just pure deletion, right? I want to delete content in OneDrive after 10 years. I want to delete content in these team sites after 1 year, because if you retain too much, it's also risky as well. So when I think about this for advice, is make sure, as around IP and IG, is check your licensing. So don't over retain, don't underestimate the power of a record. Like they're very powerful. What actually happens is it creates a library and it retains that information over there. So if you're deploying these, understand how they work, right? That's, if you think about that life cycle again, it's understanding this newer technology as a SharePoint administrator, and start to make sure you bring that up to their governance committee to figure out what needs to be done and how. And one of the newer functionalities is adaptive scopes, which is really specific to which can be specific to SharePoint sites. So I could say every SharePoint site that has this type of rule on it is going to get these labels, which is a lot of back-end SharePoint work. So if that's not deployed in your organization, as a SharePoint administrator, you're going to have to know that, right? The property bag is not dead. You actually configure settings. You use SharePoint search. You use managed metadata, or so you use managed properties. All of that kind of comes in behind the scenes. So a lot of really cool things here. I think of the evolution of administration, diving a lot more into this versus you don't have to deal with that back-end infrastructure. And now what's coming, right? So I got to get closer to wrapping stuff. What's new and what's coming for SharePoint admins? So important things to note, shared channels. So shared channels are out. They were released a couple weeks ago. Why it matters for us as SharePoint administrators is it creates a new SharePoint site collection every time. Every new shared channel is a new SharePoint site collection. It's available inside of the admin center. So we now can manage those channel creations in the active sites list. Very cool things, but be aware of that you're going to have a lot more site collections available in your environment, and that's okay. Tenant rename, if anyone's created their tenant and called it, I had one that was called like IT4 because the IT team stood up their tenant and like their entire environment was called IT4. That was bad. So now we can tenant rename, which means that URL you have in your SharePoint environment, if it was it4.sharepoint.com, maybe we can make it now contosa.sharepoint.com and provide a process to rename that, which was a very big ask that I've seen, especially in large organizations or maybe in an M&A activity. Syntax is a big, so we have content assembly now where I can actually pre-create content using different content types. I can, from a team's perspective, as I change channels, it actually, every team site creates a SharePoint channel and the folders exist as channels. Every channel exists as a folder. Those names didn't match and now they do. And a nice one for Microsoft Search is we can now create verticals. So SharePoint Search was a huge thing that we used to try to manage in SharePoint. Now we can do a lot of that in Microsoft Search for managing those verticals. And that's really what's kind of out today. Some cool stuff coming. The sensitivity labels on sites, so you can get really specific there. The connected templates, as I talked about, we'll soon be able to create sites from the SharePoint app bar. And one of the most interesting ones is going to be the SharePoint migration tool was actually going to allow us to migrate specific types of 2010 and 2013 workflows into Power Automate. And I think a general consensus around this is use the message center, figure out how to stay up to date with this information, attend different things like this, because you now need, as an administrator, your modern management is going to be following what's new. So that's a lot, right? How do we get started with some of this? I just talked about 6 different types of tools, a bunch of different questions. How do we get started? And I'd like to think about, start going back to that at the beginning and talking about the committee, talking about the open line of communications. And another thing I like to say, and with that, don't do too much. So where I've seen some organizations fail is saying, I want to deploy retention labels, I want to build site provisioning, I want to go build a governance committee, I want to go change our branding and do that all within like a month. Like that's not how it works. The way this works to be a successful administrator in modern SharePoint is you have to change with Microsoft as it moves. So start to get ahead of it, right? What you want to try to get to is becoming less reactive and more proactive. And how do you, and the way to get to be more proactive is starting to make sure you actually keep, I mean, I like to use SMART goals, right? Like think about goals that you can actually attain, build work streams and assign roles out there so you have realistic dates, and then don't let it stop, right? So there's this cadence of as new things come, right? Shared channels are now out. How do we make sure we come back and the line of communication is open with the business? So it's this big circular life cycle that we have to deal with now, but that's a good thing, right? We're less behind the scenes, we're less under the covers. The SharePoint and the modern SharePoint management world is in your face as the Microsoft product, and it's so important to have that level of communication. So as these new technologies roll out, as these functions become available or policies change in your organization, that you can start to bring those back into your organization. I think that's a core takeaway, is that allowing for that change and thinking about those questions that I brought up throughout that governance side and thinking about the new tools that you have available. So with that, right, as a whirlwind tour of some modern SharePoint management. So you can always reach out for me on Twitter. I do have a website. These slides will be up in different locations throughout. Feel free to always shoot me an email, but then I want to obviously leave some time in here for questions to go through.
Awesome. Thank you, Drew. Lots of content in there. Also, lots of questions coming. So I don't expect we'll have the time to go through all of the questions. We'll do as many as possible. A lot of you are asking for the slides, so there's a link there, but they will also be included in the email with the recording of the webinar if you want to access that. So they will be available to you very shortly. So we've got a lot of questions, Drew. So I'll jump right in. Yeah, kick it off with the first question. You ready?
Yeah.
All right. So There are some questions, so I'm going to group some questions as well. So someone asked, I'm concerned about managing SharePoint in the team's environment when you have no control over who is allowed to create teams and you are not the owner of most teams. So there's another question also asking, you know, what admin roles should a SharePoint admin really have to administrate, monitor, and govern SharePoint experience? So some questions around like how should administrators set up their own permissions, essentially, and their own accesses.
So, and we all kind of segue this into kind of the management between teams and SharePoint probably, and the roles between those two, and it's very, very blurry. I would say most organizations, it depends on this, as I've seen, as the organization gets larger, usually there's a separation of duties as it moves to that point, and you have teams administrators and SharePoint administrators. For a SharePoint administrator, I try to make sure that those people are on the same team, like in the same organization. And then when you think about their weekly meetings or their monthly meetings, that they're aware that they're very connected at the hip for things that change. Or if you have dual roles, unfortunately, that you're kind of stuck in the role. If you're going to have a lot of admin roles assigned to yourself. There's not one of the nicer additions that they've done is they've added some functionality around for the SharePoint admin role to be able to add like manage group permissions. So if I'm in the SharePoint admin center and I see a Microsoft Teams, I actually go in there and I could add and remove people from the group, which is part of that SharePoint admin role that you have, which actually adds them into the team. So there's no silver bullet, right? There's no like only special thing you have to do. There's no special admin role that you get to manage both. Where I've seen success is making sure that, again, they understand between those two teams. So if you have multiple teams administrators, multiple SharePoint administrators, that they know that if I'm making a change here, that they need to tell the other person that assigns that role, and vice versa. And when I think about teams provisioning and the question for that, I always try to think of this as starting the question with those two rules together of how are we going to build a collaboration provisioning solution. I almost think it's not necessarily Teams provisioning, SharePoint provision, that you start at the top and we're going to build collaboration provisioning. And that collaboration provisioning, it could be a single entry point, but those requirements will flow down into Teams and SharePoint. So if you think about it that way, you don't necessarily have to think about it as siloed roles. You think about it as we're establishing collaboration. We're just two people on the same team providing that level. So kind of a long-winded answer to that. It's not a great scenario, right? It's one I see struggling with. I work with organizations to try to figure out how to build the right RACIs for that. You could build a RACI to say, based on this control, based on this process, who is assigned for it, who's responsible, who needs to be informed. And that process actually to build those RACIs usually helps uncover some of the pain points of people not wanting to necessarily talk to each other or have the wrong roles assigned to them. Because if you're in a smaller organization or more shared, that RACI would give you the way to say, how do I know what admin roles I need to be assigned in my organization? So that's a tough one. I again, for everyone out here, you're not new to that challenge. Everyone's kind of struggling with that. I think of it as an opportunity for communication inside of those teams.
Great, perfect. Next question. So I know Microsoft is pushing to move away from subsites for obvious reasons. Is there also something they work on, such as an easy solution to convert subsite into a site collection?
So when we're doing subsite management, like if we have to do conversion, I always actually try to leave it more to third parties if I can a little bit. So from a migration solution standpoint, there's not an out of the box way to upgrade it, right? I can't go to a subsite and say make it at the top. So the way I deal with the way I work with organizations to work on subsite movement is, first of all, I do cleanup, right? What I see people struggle with initially is I'm doing a migration right now. We have around 1,000 site collections. And every migration or every minute process I do, I go out and we analyze and see which sites have subsites. And what you don't want to do is, let's say there's 1,000 sites and 400 of them have subsites, and one of them has like 200 subsites with like 6 layers deep. What you don't want to do is just assume, okay, we have 500 sites that have subsites, that we're going to go do all of them. Make sure you go and do an analysis to say, are those subsites actually being used, and can we go remove them or just delete them without doing anything? That's the easiest. Just don't think there's so much that you have to do just because of the count. So you figure out which ones actually have content on them and which ones are needed. So then what you do after that, what you basically, you're going to use you're going to create the parent site wherever you want, and you're going to move the content. But there is no out-of-the-box way to do it. You can automate it a little bit using some of the migration tools, but you're going to be in a copy and paste or a migration sediment once you go out there. It is a long-running process. I have a migration right now where there's a site that has 115 subsites that was used for projects. We have like a project central and projects for all subsites. As part of the migration, as part of our movement, we're going to be converting them all to site collections as part of the process and hub site it there. So the tools exist for migration. The process, I'd love to make sure you don't do everything. Don't assume subsites need to move, and then it takes time. Don't think it won't take a good amount of time. Subsite, when you do this, when you flatten things out, it can take months, it can take weeks. It's not simply like an overnight thing. It's an interaction. Say like, oh great, if there's usually, I try to think of the big ones and then go down from there. And then the other thing is, if you have site expiration, that if we're in SharePoint Online, if there are sites that have like one subsite, and if they expire, they don't need to fix it. like let them fix themselves. So make sure you prioritize the ones that need to be used. Don't kind of do too much.
All right. Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Tools like ShareGate can help you do that. Can help you see, which sites have subsites. Can help you, upgrade them, right? But there's still a lot of manual work and a lot of thought process behind how you want to reorganize it, right?
And I think it is a culture shift, right?
Yeah.
I'm as an administrator, as an expert in this space, I do just as much work with soft skills, right? With culture change. That's what we're dealing with more now. I'm not as much on the back end of SharePoint. It's more of what are these tools and how are they changing, and how do we shift as a culture to meet those needs? How do we shift as a culture to enable things like Viva Connections as an organization? As administrator, enable it, but your role has moved more into culture change, and I know I've seen some questions about that, and that's such a good point that that is a change that you have to undertake. That's a modern SharePoint management is culture shift as well.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. We're coming up on time. I think we can keep answering like a few questions still. So for those of you who need to leave us, the rest of the Q&A will be available in the recording. So we'll just go maybe like a few minutes still to answer a few more questions. Before you leave, we are sharing right now, and we'll also share it by email if I'm not mistaken. So in the chat as well, we'll share it. The document essentially, so for people attending, you're going to get access to a little exclusive document, which is a management checklist basically built by Drew. So you'll be able to have that as a little leave behind for you to use in your future SharePoint management challenges. So you'll have a nice handy tool for that. So let's keep on going with a few questions. We have migrated a lot of sites to a SharePoint Online. Prior to migrating, we asked various owners to clean up their site before migrating. That's a long question. We instituted a policy that if the site has become dormant, that we archive it. Is there, sorry, it's too long, I can't see. Is there an easy way to view all sites and determine if a site has become dormant to archive? What is the best way to manage this on a large scale?
So if you're going from on-premises, it's not great. It's very poor, to be clear. Like the way that because the way that happens on premises is if you want to look at like last access date or last modified date, especially on like the site collection side, it's going to go based on your last server install, or your last server patching. The way I've seen this be successful is actually the most successful thing is the last 2 migrations I've done. We've done communication with site owners. We've run a PowerShell script to grab the people who own the site and blast a comment saying we're going here. The most accessible thing I've done for stale sites is, especially in larger organizations, is banner them and lock them down. So let them figure out the route, right? What you can do is go out and actually banner the old site. So, and I say banner in the sense of you can either put a web part on the page, you can actually take advantage of a little bit of code to put something on the top and say, hey, your site's moving in the next 3 months unless you use, if you have to basically declare that your site's going to move. That's a good way that I've seen in multiple migrations to go get it, is to basically put it in front of their face. The other thing is, don't be afraid to turn stuff off and let them kind of come back. So a lot of people are thinking like, oh man, we have 8,000 sites. If they're all being used, and it's like, but we can't tell because the last modified date's all wrong. I'm like, well, if you know that there's like, you go basically the ones that have the last modified of the last patch date and just put them in read only. We did a migration where there's around 38,000 site collections. We identified 8,000 like 6 months before we moved and said, we'll lock them out. There was one person of those 8,000 site collections that came back because we did not have a expiration policy on premises. Like, so don't be scared to kind of lock stuff out and deal with a Band-Aid ripping off. What I think, the white glove treatment for a lot of migrations has become more of a pain than just like it's okay. Don't deal with those exceptions. Get the big ones over and let the other ones kind of sit. And then the cleanup when you're in 360, once you're in SharePoint Online, you have so much more. You actually have actual activity data, so it's not really a concern in there. The rot cleanup on-prem is much harder. If you're going to institute, I will say, if you're instituting the expiration policy online, it will retroactively go back. So if there's been no activity, it will trigger it, which is okay, right? You want that to happen. So be aware when you enable that, it will kind of go retroactively go back for when you're online. But on-prem, rip the Band-Aid off, lock the stuff down. It's okay. People will get mad, but they'll get over it because you can just go in and say, as long as you have a process for unlocking, that's fine. You're good. We'll migrate you later.
Good. All right, next one. For those SharePoint governance components like DLP, auto labeling, sensitivity, etc., you need an E5 license, or does that work with E3?
Yeah, so I love that question. I know I put in that bullet point to make sure you manage, you understand your licensing. So what I always recommend is actually and I'll put it in the FAQs, then I'll make sure we remember that one, Larry, is that there's a big spreadsheet out there that tells you based on the process what you want to do and what licensing is enabled. So there's an Excel spreadsheet right on the Microsoft site for security compliance licensing. If you have E3, if you have E5, it's not necessarily by product, it will tell you by what you want to do. At the core, the way I think about it is if you want to do anything manually, you can. Manual retention labels, manual sensitivity labels, that's fine. Anything automatic is your step up. So if I want to automatically apply retention, automatically apply sensitivity, that's your step up role. So that's my core that I start with, and then the nuances get into the details of like if I have a retention label on a library or on a folder in that library, and I add a file into that, that's technically automatic. That'd be a step up. But I love pointing to that spreadsheet as my core, which we can put in the slides or in the FAQ at the end.
Yeah, we'll find a way to include it in the follow-up email, so you all have access to that. And a little shameless plug, all those, well, I mean, not the Microsoft natives one, but everything ShareGate does doesn't require any level of Microsoft licenses. So whether you have an E3 or E5, ShareGate can help you with that. Maybe like one last one. Best way to organize SharePoint sites generated by Microsoft Teams. That was kind of like a tricky question.
Yeah, no. So this is a good one and the way you have to think about this is, and this has gotten me a little bit, right? This goes, actually, I go with sharing and site management as a whole, is people come and say, guys, or like, Drew, like, what should I do with all my sites? Like, I have 10,000 sites. I have an organization that's like 100,000 sites. I'm like, I don't care. What do you need why do you care? What are you going to do with organization? Like, the question you need to ask yourself about organization of your SharePoint sites, and because Teams is proliferating all of them, shared channels and private channels, you're going to have thousands and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of SharePoint sites in certain size orgs. I don't care. Like, why do you care? It's a platform for service, and it's a platform for files. If you need, the way to think about that from a governance perspective is identify what you need to classify and what you're going to do with that data. So what organizations do to me is sometimes they're like, I want to make sure I put the business unit and the owner in like somewhere on the site, and then potentially more metadata on that site. And I'm like, why? Like, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to report on it? If there's a value you want to do for organization, or a value you want to do to report on it, that's a metric that you can work towards. But figure out that metric. If not, let it go. Like, just go full frozen. Like, just, it's okay to have SharePoint sprawl on the back end, because what you're doing is you're administering it at a higher level, right? We're deploying settings at the top level, and what you want to do is, the best example of this is using those sensitivity label to define the rules. I don't have to do it manually. Let the users figure it out, right? If I put in this site is sensitive, great, I'm going to turn off sharing. I don't have to go in and figure out what sites and organize those specifically. The organization will matter from an initial hub site and home site creation, but once you go, it's okay. I promise you'll be okay with having a lot of SharePoint sites. It's not going to hurt you.
Yeah, embrace it. Cool. All right. So apologies for those who we weren't able to answer all the questions. Keep an eye open for the FAQ. I know there are a few questions around like file limits. There were a few of those, but
yeah, I saw those. There's a good one like tenant rename. There's some people asking about 5,000 item limit. Like, well,
yeah,
those
exactly.
are a little harder to answer online. So I think those will be good to kind of write up and point you some documentation around those. I see a lot around kind of some of the ShareGate potential, which will be good to talk about those inside of more of a documentation form versus verbal.
Perfect. Yeah, so we'll make sure to answer those questions for you. So keep an eye open for the emails following this, following the webinar. Maybe one last question as a closing statement, or and because I find it was funny, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, Drew, and I found it was a funny question. Why do you, being a Microsoft MVP, promote ShareGate as a migration tool, having Microsoft migration tools in a pocket?
Cool. I would say the ability to scale. So from a migration tool, the successful I've seen, I'm running 2 migrations right now with ShareGate, to be honest. The one is a 20 terabyte migration from 4 different farms. We've completely automated through PowerShell. Another one we're slightly automated through PowerShell, but it's I'd say the flexibility around it has been very successful. It's a very lightweight solution compared to some other ones. The SharePoint migration tool in the it fits a specific need. I like doing that one if I'm allowing more end user facing or empowering other people to move their own content. The migration, if I'm doing cloud to cloud though, I would use Migration Manager. I think that purchase has been very successful. So if I'm going cloud to cloud, that's definitely, if I'm doing tenant to tenant or a box or drive, I would stick in the Microsoft suite. If I'm doing on-prem, I kind of lean more towards this as a product because of the flexibility. So I like standing up multiple servers, especially at scale, build almost this methodology of multiple servers, all dumping data in at certain points in time. And then it uses every tool uses the insane mode here, but the more advanced Azure Blob Storage data movement, which is necessary, especially to get to high scale. Yeah, so a lot of the migrations to do are high scale, high content counts, high complexity, and I will say a lot of migrations, I barely even touch the ShareGate UI. I'm in the automation side of the world and kind of let the system do its own thing. And then the UI, I come in for cleanup and remediation. So some people might leave SharePoint pages sitting around. It's easy to point and click and move the content after the fact for remediation.
Great. Thanks, Drew. I just thought it was a funny question. I felt I had to ask that one too.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Drew. That was really insightful. We're getting a lot of positive comments and feedback in the chat. So I think everyone enjoyed the session. So a huge thank you for jumping on the Pass the Mic series. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Keep an eye open for the emails for the recording, the FAQ, and also other announcements for our content and other Pass the Mic webinars. So with that, I wish you a very good day.
Thanks, everyone.